Welcome to the third subunit of Open Data of the Open Education unit. We're going to be discussing today about how to make our data more transparently available in a public repository and what are the things that we need to think about before doing so. One of the first problems is that we might have data taking numerous formats and coming from diverse sources. For example, we might have tabular data, which is one of the most common ones, but we also could have text, video, interview transcripts from qualitative research, or sensorial data from sensors from all over the world. It's very important that we can make this data available to other researchers so that they can actually inspect it, review it, and build upon it. The basic idea is that science is a collaborative process in which other researchers build their work based on previous work. And then it's very important that they can actually access the data from previous research to keep advancing forward in the scientific procedure. Technology has greatly facilitated this issue of open data. 20 years ago, it was very hard to share with other researchers on the other side of the world your data, but now with the large storage and very fast connectivity between the entire world, this is no longer an issue. However, in a study that researchers were asking to other researchers that said that they would share the data, only 25% of the researchers that said in their papers that they would share the data actually shared the data, which is a low proportion of researchers. There are a number of options that we can use for data sharing. The first one is using portals for public data sharing. For example, we might use Open Science Framework, the same one that I mentioned in the previous subunit, to share your hypotheses. They also allow for you to store your data, or Dataverse. And I have here a nice example from researchers from Harvard and MIT, indicating how they anonymize the dataset from their massive open online courses and share this data online. They do share the tabular format of the data, and very importantly, they also share how was the identification procedure, and also the documentation that includes the code names of all of the variables and the description and a specification of each one of the variables, so that actually researchers that come and decide to use this data, they know how to use it and they can understand the data. Also, here is a citation so that it's more reusable by other researchers. Another way of sharing data is by publishing in a new data format that some journals have. For example, Nature Scientific Data or Elsevier Data in Brave allow to publish your data with a description of the dataset. And I wanted to put this example. And as you see, this kind of publication also describes how the data was collected, the background, context, and in some cases they might even use some case studies to put an example on how to use the data. This greatly facilitates that other researchers come, take the data, they can understand it with this publication, and then they can use it in their future research. It's very important when sharing data to take into account the FAIR principles. First one is findability. We need to make our data findable on the web because otherwise people cannot access it. Second one is accessibility. People need to understand how to use the data once they download it, and for that we need to provide documentation that clearly clarifies how it was built and what each variable means. Then we also need to focus on interoperability. If we share data in a proprietary format that can only be opened with a specific software, then it's not really interoperable and people won't be able to access the data. And finally, reusability. We need to make sure the researchers that access the data can use it in their own studies. Based on the when and on the whom, we can have also a spectrum on how to share your data. Depending on the when, we might share our data immediately after we have generated, or we might share the data only after this data has been published on the web. On the other side, we might have the whom, which is I might not share the data with anyone, or I might share the data with any other researcher that requests me to share my data, or even you could do allocate your data online as part of the public domain. However, there are challenges here, of course. If we are talking about data that contains private information or sensitive information, we need to make sure that we have the consent of participants and their agreements to not only use their data, but also to distribute their data as open data. Of course, it might not be a binary decision. There might be in some occasions where we have some data that we can share because it does not contain sensitive information, but some other portions of the data are private and then won't be shared online. Of course, each region has their own regulations. In this case, for example, in Europe, we have the GDPR that completely establishes what we can do with data from people. While there's some data that is not very private, like imagine that we have sensor data from the temperature from these different positions in the wall, well, there are not sensible information from anyone here. But if we have records of education or medical records, then we have very sensible data that we need to take care of. One of the things that can improve the sharing of sensible data is the anonymization. However, this process is not perfect, and there are some researchers that have shown how they can apply techniques to do reverse anonymization using third-party data in order to identify which are the original subjects. And this was a very sound example with Netflix, in which they published a data set as a part of a challenge with the movie rankings in Netflix from many of their customers. Then some researchers used the Internet Movie Database and the voting in this movie database to triangulate both ratings in order to identify the original subjects of the Netflix dataset, showing in fact that anonymizing only might not be enough. Additionally, I wanted to point out that there are some tools like IEEEx or Amnesia that greatly facilitate this process of anonymization. There are a number of things that we need to take care into account, and this is a nice overview. From the data sharing perspective, we need to think about permissions if we have the permission of subjects to share this data. We need to establish what is the license of our dataset that will explain how other people can use our data. And then we need to be very careful with sharing sensitive data. We need to make our data reusable. One good way to do that is by using a digital object identifier so that other researchers can use your data and cite the original source. And then we need to make our data discoverable, and for that we need to provide proper metadata that can be indexed so that other researchers find it by those keywords, and by those metadata they can easily find your dataset. So as conclusions, open data really helps expand and actually do better research. However, it's a real challenge to do so by preserving the privacy of the original subjects that were used to collect this data. Additionally, other challenge is that some researchers are actually afraid of scooping. That means that they might be afraid to publish their data openly because other researchers will take the data and possibly do research that they might want to do, and hence lose the opportunity to generating more research. Then we need to generate also incentives so that these researchers that are afraid of potential scooping actually want to share their data. There are several ways that we could do this, but some ideas could be to make these publications completely citable, which is something that already is being done. Possibility of co-authoring if other researchers use your data, awards to the researchers that are more open regarding their data, or to provide additional value for tenure or promotions. It's very important that the other institutions and the countries and the publishers whole conversation so that they can create policy to make this process more transparent and shift towards this direction. These are the references that I use for this presentation. Remember that you have an exercise coming up for this subunit as well, and I'll see you in next subunit. Pleasure. Bye-bye.